You see, there is something quite extraordinary about this whole business of speaking. For the moment we open our mouths to say what is true, the truth begins to slip away like trying to hold water in a clenched fist. Words are marvelous inventions. They are. And yet at the same time, they are terrible traps. They point, but they do not contain. They describe, but they never touch the living pulse of what they describe. Language is a net we cast upon the ocean of reality. And of course, it catches something, it catches fish, yes, but never the sea itself. And most of us, having forgotten the sea, go on admiring the collection of words we have caught, calling them knowledge, calling them truth. We take the label for the thing, the menu for the meal, the photograph for the person, and we wonder why we feel hungry for meaning. Now, the moment of awakening, the instant one sees through the illusion of separation, comes not in speech, but in silence. It happens in the gaps between thoughts, in the places where the mind stops trying to explain. But what happens next? The awakened one looks around and finds himself or herself among people who are still speaking, still explaining, still trying to make sense of what cannot be made sense of. And then comes the great paradox: how to speak about that which cannot be spoken. You see, the ancient sages of every tradition have stumbled upon this same difficulty. Lao Tzu begins the Tao Te Ching by saying, the Tao that can be spoken is not the eternal Tao. And yet he goes on to write 5,000 words about it. The Buddha said that the truth is beyond all words, and yet his followers filled libraries with commentary. Even Jesus, when pressed by Pontius Pilate to define truth, simply remained silent. You see, silence is not absence, it is the eloquence beyond words. But we humans are compulsive talkers. We feel that if something is not said, it is not real. We believe communication requires chatter, that wisdom must be explained, dissected, analyzed, published, and preferably sold. But the whole art of awakening is learning to rest comfortably in mystery, to allow what is unspeakable to be enough. When I say truth, I do not mean a fact, a formula, or a doctrine. I mean the living awareness that is the pulse of existence itself, and that cannot be wrapped in syllables. Every word we use is like a shadow cast by a flame. It hints at the light, but it is not the light. And yet, here we are, using words. Here I am, speaking them to you. So perhaps the question is not whether to speak, but how to speak without forgetting the silence underneath. The problem is not the word itself, but our attachment to it, our insistence that it be final, fixed, absolute. The wise use words as musicians use notes to gesture toward the silence that gives them meaning. So let us begin this exploration with reverence for the quiet space behind every sound. For in that quiet, the whole mystery breathes. It is there, in the pauses, that truth resides, unborn, unspoken, and perfectly complete. Remember this as we continue. The more we try to explain awakening, the further we drift from it. But if we listen deeply, if we allow the words to fall away into the stillness from which they arise, we may discover something far more intimate than understanding. We may discover the awareness that listens. That is the beginning of wisdom. You see, there is something quite extraordinary about this whole business of speaking. For the moment we open our mouths to say what is true, the truth begins to slip away like trying to hold water in a clenched fist. Words are marvelous inventions. They are. And yet at the same time, they are terrible traps. They point, but they do not contain. They describe, but they never touch the living pulse of what they describe. Language is a net we cast upon the ocean of reality. And of course, it catches something, it catches fish. Yes, but never the sea itself. And most of us, having forgotten the sea, go on admiring the collection of words we have caught, calling them knowledge, calling them truth. We take the label for the thing, the menu for the meal, the photograph for the person, and we wonder why we feel hungry for meaning. Now, the moment of awakening, the instant one sees through the illusion of separation, comes not in speech but in silence. It happens in the gaps between thoughts, in the places where the mind stops trying to explain. But what happens next? The awakened one looks around and finds himself or herself among people who are still speaking, still explaining, still trying to make sense of what cannot be made sense of. And then comes the great paradox: how to speak about that which cannot be spoken. You see, the ancient sages of every tradition have stumbled upon this same difficulty. Lao Tzu begins the Tao Te Ching by saying, the Tao that can be spoken is not the eternal Tao, and yet he goes on to write 5,000 words about it. The Buddha said that the truth is beyond all words, and yet his followers filled libraries with commentary. Even Jesus, when pressed by Pontius Pilate to define truth, simply remained silent. You see, silence is not absence, it is the eloquence beyond words. But we humans are compulsive talkers. We feel that if something is not said, it is not real. We believe communication requires chatter, that wisdom must be explained, dissected, analyzed, published, and preferably sold. But the whole art of awakening is learning to rest comfortably in mystery, to allow what is unspeakable to be enough. When I say truth, I do not mean a fact, a formula, or a doctrine. I mean the living awareness that is the pulse of existence itself, and that cannot be wrapped in syllables. Every word we use is like a shadow cast by a flame. It hints at the light, but it is not the light. And yet, here we are, using words. Here I am, speaking them to you. So perhaps the question is not whether to speak, but how to speak, without forgetting the silence underneath. The problem is not the word itself, but our attachment to it, our insistence that it be final, fixed, absolute. The wise use words, as musicians use notes, to gesture toward the silence that gives them meaning. So let us begin this exploration with reverence for the quiet space behind every sound. For in that quiet, the whole mystery breathes. It is there, in the pauses, that truth resides, unborn, unspoken, and perfectly complete. Remember this as we continue. The more we try to explain awakening, the further we drift from it. But if we listen deeply, if we allow the words to fall away into the stillness from which they arise, we may discover something far more intimate than understanding. We may discover the awareness that listens. That is the beginning of wisdom. You see, when a man or a woman truly awakens, something very curious happens. It is not that they suddenly become wise in the worldly sense, or that they acquire a new set of ideas to argue about at dinner parties. No, it is much simpler and much stranger. They lose the appetite for noise. Now, by noise, I don't only mean the clamor of traffic or the hum of machines. I mean the endless chatter of the mind, the running commentary, the judgments, the opinions, the compulsive urge to tell everyone what one thinks about everything. Awakening exposes that inner monologue for what it is, a nervous habit of the ego, forever trying to prove its own existence by making sound. And once you see through that, you find there is very little left to say. The world, you might notice, is obsessed with opinions. We build our sense of identity out of what we approve and what we condemn. We are told that to matter, we must have a view on every subject under the sun. But when the illusion of the separate me collapses, who is left to hold a view? Whose opinion is it, really? The awakened person looks at this game and smiles, because they see that every argument is one mask debating another. When one begins to perceive this, words start to feel heavy, sticky. To speak as before requires pretending again to put the mask back on, to play the part of someone. And that is why the awakened often retreat into silence, not out of superiority, but because conversation, as it is usually practiced, asks them to lie just a little. It asks them to believe in the self they have already seen through. Society, of course, finds this withdrawal alarming. It interprets quietness as aloofness, solitude as rejection. But the silence of the awakened is not a wall. It is a kind of listening. They are not turning away from the world, they are finally hearing it. When the mind stops rehearsing its own script, the song of life becomes audible again. The hum of existence, the subtle rhythm of breath, the unspoken intimacy between everything that is. There is a saying in Zen that when the sage is asked about truth, he answers with a single raised finger, or perhaps by simply closing his eyes. The gesture is not meant to mystify, but to point out that the answer cannot be heard as a statement. It can only be realized as awareness itself. Words may describe the moon, but they cannot replace the light on your skin. So the quietness of the awakened is not suppression, it is reverence. It is the natural hush that falls when the orchestra stops tuning and the music is about to begin. It is a pause made of respect for what cannot be contained. And this is the heart of the paradox. Once you understand deeply, there is nothing left to argue, and yet everything becomes infinitely interesting. You no longer wish to convince anyone, because you see that each being is already the whole expressing itself as that particular form. You can listen to disagreement with the same serenity with which you listen to bird song. Both are the universe talking to itself. To be silent, then, is not to withdraw from life, but to merge with it so completely that the need to comment disappears. The awakened one becomes transparent, like clear water. You can look right through and see only what is beyond. And so, when you meet such a person, you may notice that they do not rush to fill the space between you with explanations. They let silence do most of the speaking, for they know that beneath the noise of our words, beneath even the thoughts that give them shape, there is a deeper conversation always happening, the wordless dialogue of being with itself. That is why the awakened become quiet, not out of renunciation, but out of completion. They have nothing to add, because they have finally become the listening itself. You see, when a man or a woman truly awakens, something very curious happens. It is not that they suddenly become wise in the worldly sense, or that they acquire a new set of ideas to argue about at dinner parties. No, it is much simpler and much stranger. They lose the appetite for noise. Now, by noise, I don't only mean the clamor of traffic or the hum of machines. I mean the endless chatter of the mind, the running commentary, the judgments, the opinions, the compulsive urge to tell everyone what one thinks about everything. Awakening exposes that inner monologue for what it is, a nervous habit of the ego, forever trying to prove its own existence by making sound. And once you see through that, you find there is very little left to say. The world, you might notice, is obsessed with opinions. We build our sense of identity out of what we approve and what we condemn. We are told that to matter, we must have a view on every subject under the sun. But when the illusion of the separate me collapses, who is left to hold a view? Whose opinion is it, really? The awakened person looks at this game and smiles, because they see that every argument is one mask debating another. When one begins to perceive this, words start to feel heavy, sticky. To speak as before requires pretending again to put the mask back on, to play the part of someone. And that is why the awakened often retreat into silence, not out of superiority, but because conversation, as it is usually practiced, asks them to lie, just a little. It asks them to believe in the self they have already seen through. Society, of course, finds this withdrawal alarming. It interprets quietness as aloofness, solitude as rejection. But the silence of the awakened is not a wall. It is a kind of listening. They are not turning away from the world. They are finally hearing it. When the mind stops rehearsing its own script, the song of life becomes audible again. The hum of existence, the subtle rhythm of breath, the unspoken intimacy between everything that is. There is a saying in Zen that when the sage is asked about truth, he answers with a single raised finger, or perhaps by simply closing his eyes. The gesture is not meant to mystify, but to point out that the answer cannot be heard as a statement, it can only be realized as awareness itself. Words may describe the moon, but they cannot replace the light on your skin. So the quietness of the awakened is not suppression, it is reverence. It is the natural hush that falls when the orchestra stops tuning and the music is about to begin. It is a pause made of respect for what cannot be contained. And this is the heart of the paradox. Once you understand deeply, there is nothing left to argue, and yet everything becomes infinitely interesting. You no longer wish to convince anyone, because you see that each being is already the whole, expressing itself as that particular form. You can listen to disagreement with the same serenity with which you listen to birdsong. Both are the universe talking to itself. To be silent, then, is not to withdraw from life, but to merge with it so completely that the need to comment disappears. The awakened one becomes transparent, like clear water. You can look right through and see only what is beyond. And so, when you meet such a person, you may notice that they do not rush to fill the space between you with explanations. They let silence do most of the speaking, for they know that beneath the noise of our words, beneath even the thoughts that give them shape, there is a deeper conversation always happening, the wordless dialogue of being with itself. That is why the awakened become quiet, not out of renunciation, but out of completion. They have nothing to add, because they have finally become the listening itself. You see, there comes a moment in the life of every seeker, a moment so subtle and so immense that it cannot quite be said to happen to anyone. It is as if the boundary between you and everything else dissolves, and the world ceases to be something you are looking at, but something you are being. Now, in that instant, there is no observer, no experiencer, no commentary. There is only this, alive, immediate, unspeakable. It is the moment the mind has been chasing forever. The truth behind every prayer, every meditation, every restless seeking. And yet, the moment you try to describe it, it vanishes. To speak of it is to separate yourself from it again. It's like a man trying to photograph the sunlight. He captures the reflection, but not the warmth. The camera records the image, but the experience of light cannot be frozen. In the same way, the instant you say, "I had an awakening," the eye slips back in, proud of its accomplishment, and the seeing collapses into a story. This is why the old mystics warned against speaking too soon. They knew that once you turn the ineffable into a narrative, it becomes part of the ego's collection, a shiny badge to be displayed at the next spiritual gathering. You see, the ego is a very clever magician. It can even disguise itself as enlightenment. It whispers, "Tell them what you've seen. Share your awakening." And before you know it, the living mystery has been reduced to a memory, a performance. But awakening is not a possession. It is not your experience. It is the disappearance of ownership altogether. You cannot have the infinite, because the moment you do, it becomes finite. You cannot put the ocean in a bucket, even if the bucket is labeled spiritual. So the first thing never to share after awakening is the experience itself. Not because it is forbidden, but because it is sacred in a very practical way. It simply cannot survive the translation into words. To describe it is to falsify it, not by intention, but by nature. It is like trying to sing silence. Now, this is not to say you must keep quiet forever. There are ways of communicating the ineffable. but they do not depend on description. You can express it through the quality of your presence, the gentleness in your laughter, the way you move without hurry, the way you listen without the urge to reply. These things speak more truly than any proclamation of enlightenment. The trouble begins when one forgets that the words are only pointers. The teacher who says, "Look at the moon," does not want you to stare at his finger. Yet humanity has spent centuries building temples around the finger, arguing about its size, its color, its direction, all the while missing the moon itself. When the great mystics fell silent, it wasn't because they had nothing to say, it was because they had seen too much. They realized that no sound could carry it. No concept could contain it, and so they smiled and let the silence speak for them. So if the day comes when you awaken, truly awaken, and the universe unfolds within you like a flower opening in slow motion, resist the temptation to turn it into a speech. Let it change you, not your vocabulary. Let it sing through your being, not through your biography. For in that quiet recognition, you will understand what every enlightened being eventually learns. That truth cannot be said, it can only be lived. You know, one of the first things people want to ask when they hear that someone has awakened is, how did you do it? We are all terribly fond of methods, you see. We want steps, techniques, recipes, something we can measure and reproduce, like baking a cake. We imagine that enlightenment must have a secret formula, a reliable sequence of procedures, that if followed correctly, will guarantee illumination. But awakening is not a science experiment. It is not something you accomplish. It is something that happens when you stop trying to make it happen. There are no mechanics to awakening because there is no machine to fix. There is no lever to pull, no button to press. The whole notion of a path is a kind of cosmic joke. For the one who walks the path is the very illusion that awakening exposes. Yet still, the human mind cannot resist. It wants to know, what meditation were you doing? How many hours a day? What book did you read? What mantra did you chant? And perhaps there was a practice, perhaps there were many. But these are not the causes of awakening. They are simply the ways in which consciousness distracted itself long enough for grace to slip in unnoticed. When you share the so-called mechanics of awakening, you invite imitation. And imitation is sleep-wearing the mask of effort. The one who imitates another's awakening misses the entire point, for no two awakenings are ever the same. The path appears only beneath your own feet. The instant you try to copy someone else's, you are already walking in their dream, not your own. You see, awakening is like a flower blooming. You can watch the petals unfold, but you cannot tell the flower how to open. You can water it, you can expose it to the sun. But the blooming itself, that happens by its own mysterious rhythm. And so it is with consciousness. You can prepare the soil of your being. You can clear the weeds of distraction. But the moment of seeing is not yours to command. It happens when you least expect it, perhaps while washing dishes, or walking in the rain, or laughing at something absurd. And this is why it is dangerous to explain how it happened to you. Because the moment you do, you turn it into a formula. The ego loves formulas. It says, now I know what to do. I'll replicate it. And there it is again. The same self that was supposed to dissolve, now busily constructing a ladder to heaven. But awakening is not reached by climbing. It comes when you realize there was never anywhere to go. The more you explain how you awakened, the more you reinforce the illusion that there is something to achieve. And so you unintentionally strengthen the very structure that awakening dissolves. That is why the old Zen masters used to say, don't tell anyone your method. Not because it was secret, but because there isn't one. Each person must find their own way to stop searching. One awakens through sitting quietly, another through heartbreak, another through laughter, another through sheer exhaustion. There is no recipe for losing yourself. When you speak of the mechanics, you turn something fluid into something fixed. But reality, you see, is not a machine, it's a dance. You don't explain the steps of the dance, you feel the rhythm and move with it. To dissect the dance is to miss the music. So, the second thing never to share after awakening is the method. Not because it is forbidden, but because it doesn't really exist in the way people think it does. The finger that pressed the switch is not what turned on the light, it was the electricity, which was always there, waiting for a moment of contact. Let others discover their own current. You can encourage them to listen, to relax, to notice, but never to copy. For what you did was simply the universe pretending to be you, awakening to itself through a very specific expression of form. And that, my friends, cannot be repeated. The truest instruction is your presence, your stillness, your humor, your lightness of being. These communicate more than any explanation ever could. People don't awaken because of your method. They awaken because, in your presence, they remember their own. So let the mystery remain mysterious. Smile when they ask, how did it happen? And perhaps say, by accident. For in a way, it's true. Awakening happens by accident, but meditation, sincerity, and love make you accident-prone. You see, one of the most curious and uncomfortable consequences of awakening is that, for a time, it drags into the light everything you once managed to keep in the dark. The old pains, the buried fears, the rejected parts of yourself, all the things politely hidden behind the mask of being a good person, begin to stir. And you discover, to your astonishment, that enlightenment is not all halo and harp music. It is also thunder and earthquake. Because to wake up is to see the whole of yourself, not only the part you've rehearsed for public display. It is to meet your shadow, the accumulated residue of every emotion you suppressed, every truth you denied, every longing you disowned. And the meeting is not gentle. The shadow does not bow to your spirituality. It kicks in the door at 3 in the morning and demands to be loved. Now, the temptation, of course, is to talk about it, to turn this confrontation into a story. We wish to confess, to analyze, to broadcast our darkness under the pretense of authenticity. But you must understand, the shadow does not heal through speech. It heals through seeing. And that seeing happens in silence, in solitude, in the unflinching gaze of awareness that neither condemns nor excuses. When you start describing your demons to others, you risk reviving them. The moment you speak, the mind begins to edit, to dramatize, to make sense of what was never meant to make sense. The raw energy of the shadow becomes a narrative, something you identify with again, something to defend or to decorate. You transform living energy into frozen identity, and the old mask returns wearing new spiritual makeup. It is not that you must never share your struggles. It is that you must share them only after they have turned into understanding. A wound that is still bleeding should not be used as decoration. The shadow's purpose is not to make you tragic, it is to make you whole. And wholeness demands silence, patience, digestion. Just as the stomach works in darkness to transform what it receives into nourishment, so the soul needs its quiet interior to transform pain into wisdom. You see, most people imagine awakening as an escape from darkness. But in truth, it is a descent into it. The light of consciousness shines into the caves of the unconscious, and what it finds there can be shocking. You discover resentments, attachments, secret pride, lust, envy, the whole colorful parade of human madness, and you realize they were all yours. The saints and the sinners are both in residence, right behind your ribs. And yet, to see this clearly is liberation. Because when you stop pretending to be purely light, you find that even your shadow is part of the dance. The contrast gives the light its radiance. The universe does not reject any of itself. Why should you? Now, those who rush to speak of their shadow often do so because silence feels unbearable. They want to discharge the tension by explaining it. But awareness is not therapy. It is intimacy. It asks you to sit quietly with your own discomfort, to befriend it without trying to fix it, to say, "Ah, yes, even this is me," and watch how the darkness begins to soften in the warmth of your attention. So the third thing never to share too soon after awakening is your encounter with the shadow. Not because it's shameful, but because it's sacred. It is the alchemical work, the transformation of lead into gold. And alchemy must happen in the furnace, not on the public square. Let the process ripen in secret. When the lead has turned to gold, your presence will speak for itself. You will not need to explain what you have integrated. It will shine through your eyes. And when you have met your shadow and embraced it, you will laugh. Because you will see that the very thing you feared most, the darkness, was simply another disguise of light, playing hide and seek with itself. That laughter, that gentle understanding, is the mark of true awakening. It is the sound of the shadow bowing to the sun. You know, one of the most delightful, yet dangerous, byproducts of awakening is that the universe begins to wink at you. You start noticing strange coincidences, numbers repeating, dreams coming true, thoughts manifesting, birds landing exactly when you think of freedom. The whole cosmos seems to conspire in intimate conversation with your awareness. And, of course, it is, but here lies a marvelous trick. The moment you start taking it personally, you've fallen back asleep. You see, consciousness, once awakened, begins to see its own reflection everywhere. It recognizes itself in the pattern of clouds, in the timing of events, in the sudden appearance of an old friend at precisely the right moment. And naturally, the mind, poor thing, rushes to interpret this. It says, "Ah, I must be special. The universe is sending me messages." But the truth is much simpler and infinitely more profound. There is no me separate from the universe to receive a message. The universe isn't speaking to you, it's speaking as you. The wind doesn't whisper secrets. It is your breath, moving in another form. The temptation to announce these visions and synchronicities, to declare that you have been chosen or gifted with insight, is enormous. The ego, like a moth that refuses to learn, is drawn once again to the flame of importance. And the tragedy is that in claiming the experience, you lose it. You turn the dance of mystery into another autobiography. Every genuine mystical vision, every symbol, every synchronicity is meant to dissolve the self, not decorate it. It's the universe's way of saying, "Look, you and I are not two." But if you rush to tell others about it, the mind quietly reasserts, "Yes, I had a revelation." And in that very statement, separation returns. Now, this is not to say that visions and synchronicities are illusions. They are very real, but their purpose is to reveal reality, not to confer prestige. They are glimpses through the veil, beautiful, playful hints of the unity behind appearances. But they are not souvenirs to be collected. The instant you post about them, they fade into imagination. The saints and mystics of old understood this perfectly. They would see visions, hear the voices of angels, glimpse radiant forms, and yet, when asked about it, they would smile and say nothing, because they knew that sacred experiences, like butterflies, cannot be caught without killing their beauty. If the universe chooses to show itself to you in some mysterious way, bow to it, thank it, and then let it pass. Don't make a career out of your visions. Don't turn synchronicity into superstition. The divine is not a system of signs to be decoded. It is the living intelligence of life itself, endlessly improvising. And you will notice something miraculous if you stop clutching at these experiences. They will deepen. They will lose their spectacle and gain their subtlety. The miraculous will no longer appear as interruptions in the ordinary, it will become the ordinary itself. You will no longer need the fireworks of the mystical, because the simple act of breathing will feel like revelation enough. So, the fourth thing never to share after awakening is your specialness. Not because you should hide it, but because it doesn't exist. There is no special self that has been chosen by God or destiny. There is only life recognizing itself through the pattern that you call you. To be humble does not mean to think little of yourself. It means to see clearly that there was never a yourself to magnify or diminish. When you realize this, every synchronicity becomes a quiet nod from the cosmos. Every vision, a reminder that you are both the dreamer and the dream. And when that understanding ripens, the extraordinary and the ordinary merge. The divine descends into the commonplace. You can watch the kettle boil and feel the whole mystery of existence humming through it. You can tie your shoes and hear the laughter of God in the bending of the lace. Then you need no more signs. You have become the sign itself. You see, one of the most bewildering things about awakening is that it quietly dismantles the machinery of should and should not. For as long as you believed yourself to be a separate self, an actor in the cosmic play, it made sense to have a script. Society hands you one the moment you arrive. Be good, be kind, obey, conform, seek approval, avoid punishment. And for a while, this script keeps the show tidy. It prevents too much improvisation. But when awakening dawns, the actor looks down at the costume and realizes it was all make-believe. The rules were never carved into the fabric of the universe. They were chalk lines drawn on the playground of the mind. Now, this does not mean that the awakened person becomes lawless or reckless, quite the opposite. It means they have discovered that genuine morality arises not from obedience, but from understanding. When you know, deep in your bones, that there is no separation between yourself and the rest of the world, compassion becomes as natural as breathing. You no longer need commandments. Your own heart becomes the law. But try explaining this to the crowd, and you'll cause a panic. Because society depends on rules, and rules depend on fear. People imagine that if they stopped clinging to morality, chaos would ensue. Yet they forget love needs no policing. The stars do not require traffic lights, and the tides do not consult a manual. Order exists in freedom. When you begin to live from this inner freedom, you may notice how fragile other people's certainties become in your presence. You will seem unpredictable, even dangerous, because you no longer dance to the usual music. You may laugh at things that others take seriously, or show kindness where they expect condemnation. The awakened are difficult to categorize precisely because they are not following categories at all. Now, there is a great temptation here, the temptation to announce your freedom. The mind, always proud of its latest acquisition, wants to shout, "I am beyond good and evil." And of course, the moment you say that, you are right back inside the game, playing the role of the enlightened rebel. The self has smuggled itself in through the back door, wearing a halo made of irony. True freedom from morality is silent. It does not parade itself. It expresses itself through effortless kindness. The awakened one does not need to proclaim, "I am compassionate." Compassion simply radiates from them, like fragrance from a flower. And it is the same with integrity, with honesty, with humility. These are not rules to be obeyed. They are the natural scent of awareness. You see, as long as you believe morality is something you must do, you remain divided, a doer trying to be good. But the moment you see that goodness is the spontaneous movement of an undivided life, morality dissolves into joy. Then helping others is no longer a duty. It's play. Forgiving becomes laughter. This is why the awakened seldom talk about ethics. They live it unconsciously. Their goodness is not moralistic, it is musical. They are in tune with the harmony of things, and the tune takes care of itself. So the fifth thing never to share after awakening is this discovery of inner freedom. Do not boast that you are beyond conventions, for that boast only shows you are still bound by them. Keep your freedom quietly, like a secret song. Let your actions reveal it, not your declarations. The truly liberated person has nothing to prove. They can walk in any society, wear any mask, follow or break any rule, not because they despise form, but because they see through it. They can bow in a temple or dance in a tavern with the same reverence, for they have understood that holiness and ordinariness are two sides of the same coin. And once you realize this, morality becomes like grammar. It is useful for clarity, but not the purpose of the poem. When life itself becomes poetry, you no longer worry whether each line rhymes with convention. You listen for the rhythm of truth. So live rightly, but not self-righteously. Be gentle, not because you should, but because you cannot help it. For when you are awake, kindness is not virtue, it is your very nature breathing. You see, perhaps the most shattering moment of awakening, and the most liberating, is the recognition that the person you thought you were never really existed. That I, that busy little narrator inside your head, who comments on everything, who plans, regrets, worries, boasts, and apologizes, that voice is not the true you. It is a kind of echo. It has no substance of its own. Now, at first, this realization feels like death, because, in a way, it is. The self you've been defending all your life suddenly evaporates, and you discover that you were protecting a ghost. The you thought was behind the eyes was never there. It was an image reflected in a mirror that has no back. And this can be terrifying, you know, because our entire civilization is built around the maintenance of identity. Everything you do, from your education to your career, your relationships, even your spirituality, is designed to reinforce the sense that you are somebody. But awakening reveals that somebody to be a character in a play that consciousness has been watching all along. When this is first seen, the ego panics. It will do anything to survive, even turn enlightenment into a new identity. It will say, now I am the awakened one, the detached observer, the witness of all things. But notice, that is just the old self wearing a new mask. The costume has changed, but the actor is still insisting on being center stage. The death of personal identity is not the adoption of a new role. It is the end of the theater altogether. It is the recognition that there was never a separate observer watching the world. The observer was the world watching itself. When you see this, something beautiful happens. The fear of death vanishes, because there is no one left to die. You realize that consciousness is not in you. You are in consciousness. You are a wave in the vast ocean of being. The wave rises and falls, but the ocean remains untouched. When the wave forgets its water, it becomes frightened of ending. But when it remembers its nature, the crash upon the shore becomes an act of joy. This is why the awakened often laugh when asked, "Who are you?" Because they know there is no answer that can satisfy the questioner. They may say, "I am no one in particular," or "I am what is happening right now," or simply smile and pour another cup of tea. They know that the self is a useful fiction, a name tag worn by the infinite for the sake of conversation. But this understanding cannot be spoken without distorting it. If you say, "I am nobody," you've already made somebody out of nobody. The truth cannot be declared. It can only be lived. When you no longer believe in the story of me, you move through life lightly, freely, without the burden of constant self-concern. You can play any role, friend, parent, lover, teacher, but you no longer mistake the costume for the actor. And this brings a kind of spontaneous humility, because if you are no one, then everyone you meet is yourself in another disguise. You bow naturally, without ritual. You listen without the filter of preference. You act without anxiety over how it will reflect upon your image, because the image is gone. So, the sixth thing never to share after awakening is the death of your personal identity, not because it should be hidden, but because it cannot be explained. To speak of it too soon tempts the ego to make a monument out of its own funeral. It begins to say, I have transcended the self. And in that very sentence, the self is reborn. Better to let the death of me complete itself quietly, like a candle burning out at dawn. Let the new light emerge naturally, without fanfare. When the personal identity dissolves, you do not disappear into nothingness, you dissolve into everythingness. You find that what you truly are has been here all along, behind every thought, before every word, and within every breath. And from that recognition flows a laughter deeper than joy, a freedom that asks for nothing, a love that has no object, because there is no one left to withhold it. So when someone asks you who you are, you may smile and say, no one in particular. And in that smile, the universe recognizes itself. You see, there comes a point, and it is not really a point in time, when even the distinction between the seer and what is seen disappears. It's as though the world, which once looked like a great multitude of things, suddenly folds in on itself like a hand closing around nothing. Everything that was out there and everything that was in here reveal themselves to be two sides of the same gesture. At first, this is bewildering. The mind, trained for a lifetime to divide, wants to say, everything is one. But notice the trick it plays. Even that statement creates two, everything and one. The very effort to express unity splits it apart. The truth cannot be spoken because speech itself requires division, a speaker, a listener, and the words in between. So what is this vision of oneness? It is not a thought, not a conclusion, not even a mystical feeling. It is the simple, direct recognition that what you call life is not happening to you, it is happening as you. There is no boundary where you end and the rest begins. The trees you see outside your window are not things standing in space, they are your lungs turned inside out. The clouds that move above are the breath of your own awareness made visible. The vision of oneness is not an experience that occurs within consciousness. It is the realization that consciousness is all there ever was. There is no container and no contained. Just as fire burns without asking who it is, being simply is. Now, when this becomes clear, there is an immense simplicity, a cosmic relaxation. You no longer strain to make sense of things. You see that every contradiction, every polarity, good and evil, life and death, self and other, are not enemies but lovers, dancing eternally as each other's reflection. You cannot have up without down, front without back, light without shadow. The game only works because it plays both sides. To share this vision, however, is impossible. For the moment you speak it, the listener imagines that they are outside of it, trying to get in. They imagine that oneness is a state to be achieved rather than the nature of what already is. And so, out of love, out of compassion, the awakened one often keeps silent, not because they wish to hide the truth, but because they know that truth cannot be given, only recognized. The old sages used to say, he who knows does not speak, and he who speaks does not know. It sounds paradoxical, but it simply means that words are echoes, and the echo is never the song itself. When you see the unity of all things, you stop trying to convince anyone. You realize that every being is already a perfect expression of that oneness, even in their confusion, even in their striving. From this seeing arises a deep tenderness, for you know that every quarrel is consciousness arguing with itself. Every act of cruelty is the infinite pretending to forget its own heart. You cannot take it too seriously anymore. yet you love it all the more for its divine absurdity. Now, you might think that such realization would make one withdraw from the world, but it does quite the opposite. When you know that everything is yourself, you begin to care for it as naturally as you care for your own hands. You feed the hungry, not out of virtue, but because you feel their hunger in your belly. You tend to the earth not as a duty, but as an act of self-respect. But this cannot be proclaimed. The instant you declare, "I have realized oneness," the unity shatters into the one who knows and the many who do not. That is why the wise simply live it. They walk quietly, they smile often, they answer questions with laughter or silence. The radiance of their being says more than philosophy ever could. So the seventh thing never to share after awakening is the vision of oneness itself. Not because it must be kept secret, but because it has nowhere to go. You cannot transmit oneness through explanation, you can only embody it. You cannot describe it to another, you can only invite them into the silence where they might notice it for themselves. And when they do, they will laugh, because they will realize that it was never missing. The truth was not hidden behind the world. It was the world all along. Every sound, every sorrow, every smile, every heartbeat was the infinite looking back at itself. To see this clearly is to be finished with seeking, finished with preaching, finished even with the idea of enlightenment. You simply live, and your living becomes your teaching. Every gesture, every breath, every moment of stillness whispers the same unspoken truth. All is one, and there was never another. You see, when all the words have fallen away, when the teachings, the scriptures, the arguments and ideas have been exhausted, what remains is silence. And this silence is not mere absence, it is not the emptiness of a quiet room or the pause between sentences. It is the living stillness out of which every sound is born and into which every sound returns. If you listen carefully, you will notice that even as I speak, it is the silence that makes the words possible. The gaps between them, the spaces in which they echo, that is where understanding hides. Without that background of stillness, speech would be a blur of noise. Silence is the canvas. Words are the brushstrokes. This is why, through the centuries, the great teachers spoke less and less as they grew older. Their words became shorter, simpler, and more playful, until eventually they said nothing at all, not because they had run out of things to say, but because they had discovered that silence says it better. You see, the mind believes communication requires noise, vibrations moving through the air. But true communication happens in the field of awareness itself, where there is no separation between speaker and listener. In that space, silence becomes eloquent. It carries understanding the way the ocean carries a boat, effortlessly, invisibly, without destination. When the Buddha held up a single flower before his disciples, one among them, Mahakashyapa, simply smiled. And the Buddha said, "I have given him the true teaching. No sermon, no doctrine, no explanation, just the shared recognition of what cannot be said." That smile, that pause, that breathless moment of unspoken knowing, that is transmission. So you see, the real teaching does not lie in the words of the awakened, but in the silence that surrounds them. It is why, when you sit with someone who has seen through the illusion of self, you feel calmer without knowing why. Their stillness becomes contagious. You begin to breathe differently, to hear the quiet between your own thoughts. Their silence speaks to your silence, and something wordless passes between you. This is what the mystics meant when they said, the teacher and the student are not two. It is not that information is being transferred. It is that awareness recognizes itself in another form. Words may draw the outline, but silence fills in the picture. And this is why the awakened use language not to explain, but to point like a finger toward the moon. The wise do not mistake the finger for the moon, nor do they stare at the finger. They use it only long enough to glimpse the direction, and then they fall quiet. The truest moment of understanding comes when the talking stops. Now, this silence is not something you create. You don't make yourself still. The attempt to be silent is itself a kind of noise. Rather, you discover that silence is already here, waiting beneath the chatter. It is the ground upon which every thought stands. Even the mind's loudest confusion floats on a bed of infinite stillness. And here's the lovely paradox. When you see this, you begin to speak differently. You no longer use words to persuade, to impress, or to perform. You speak as music arises spontaneously, from quiet. Your words come and go like ripples on the surface of still water, leaving no trace. Then even your speech becomes a kind of silence, clothed in sound. So the role of silence in transmission is not to replace words, but to remind them where they come from. Without silence, words are lies. With silence, they become poetry. The best teacher is not the one who fills your head with thoughts, but the one who empties it, who leaves you staring into the vast, unnameable simplicity of what is. To listen to such a teacher is to hear the universe listening to itself. You see, there comes a time when even the silence ripens into motion again. After the long withdrawal, after the dissolving of words, the fading of the self, and the laughter that follows, life begins to whisper once more, "Come back, come dance." And the awakened, having disappeared into the stillness of being, begin to reappear not as the same person who left, but as something softer, lighter, freer. They return to the market, to the noise, to the small human confusions of buying vegetables and missing buses and laughing at the wrong moment. Only now, none of it feels like a mistake. You see, the return to the world is not a retreat from enlightenment. It is its completion. The purpose of awakening was never to escape the play, but to remember that it is a play and then to enjoy it again. The actor, having realized the stage's illusion, does not storm off in protest. He bows deeply and continues to act, but now with joy instead of anxiety. The awakened one lives in the world as a kind of transparency. They work, they eat, they love, they grieve, but the weight has gone out of it. The seriousness has melted. They can play any role: parent, partner, teacher, stranger, yet none of these roles stick. They are garments worn for the moment and set aside with a smile. This is what it means to live in the world but not of it. You still feel the rain, but you no longer curse the weather. You still see suffering, but you no longer despair, because you see through it to the boundless life that gives birth even to sorrow. You move among people not as a savior, but as a friend who quietly remembers what others have forgotten. And this is the secret of the return. You realize there is no separation between the sacred and the ordinary. The sound of a train, the cry of a child, the taste of tea, each is the universe proclaiming itself. Every face becomes the face of the divine. Every gesture, no matter how small, carries the shimmer of eternity. The awakened do not stand apart from the world. They stand within it, utterly. Their stillness walks among noise. Their silence speaks through laughter. Their compassion works unseen, like the roots of a tree nourishing the soil around it. And they share their insight, not through preaching, but through presence, the way a flame lights another candle without ever losing itself. You might not recognize such a person at first. They do not advertise themselves as enlightened. They might be sweeping a floor, or driving a taxi, or listening quietly while others argue. But if you look closely, you'll see something in their eyes, a depth, a softness, as though they are listening to a song that no one else can hear. This is the return. To live again as the ordinary, but to know silently that the ordinary is the miracle. The true sage does not float above the world in clouds of metaphysics. He walks barefoot through the mud, laughing, weeping, eating, sleeping, but all the while free. And you, too, will return. After the solitude, after the silence, after the deep cocoon of transformation, you will re-enter the flow of life. You will answer messages, pay bills, meet friends. But something indefinable will be different. You will know, without knowing how you know, that nothing can be lost, that even in the noise, the silence remains. Even in the crowd, the one who sees is still seeing. And so you move through life like music through air, invisible, inseparable, leaving no trace, yet touching everything. This, dear listener, is the final secret. Awakening does not end the story. It teaches you how to read it differently. Once you've seen through the play, you no longer wish to escape it. You bow to it, laugh with it, and love it as yourself. And when the curtain finally falls, as it must for every form, you realize it was never a curtain at all, only the hand of the infinite opening and closing in rhythm with its own heartbeat. So go on. Return to your world. Drink your tea, answer your letters, take your walks, but do it all with the quiet awareness that you are not in life, you are life playing. And that, my friends, is the great cosmic joke, the end of the search and the beginning of truly living.